call ourselves 24/7 Solar because we deliver solar-generated electricity around the clock, and that's different. I'm Bruce Anderson, CEO and founder of 24/7 Solar. The world must reduce its carbon footprint. We must eliminate carbon emissions. The only way to do that is to make electricity without emissions all the time, every hour of the day. Photovoltaics, solar panels don't do that. They only operate during the day. Wind doesn't do that. It only produces electricity when the wind's blowing, and people just can't live their lives that way. So to get to zero carbon, we have to have clean power 24 hours a day. 24/7 solar technology is really versatile. It can address many applications. We can do, of course, electricity 24 hours a day, but like all engines, including your car engine, we put out heat. And so that heat can also be used, which makes it more versatile. We can generate temperatures hot enough to melt steel and make cement. Producing heat for industry and other applications is one of the great assets of our system. Almost every industrial process that is making something, not assembling something, but making something, requires both electricity and heat, and we can supply both. The biggest milestone in the life of 24/7 Solar is going to be when we flip that switch at our site in Arizona, our full-scale modular system, our product that produces 400 kilowatts. When we complete the plant, flip the switch, start producing electricity, that will demonstrate to the world what this technology is really capable of doing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel on the African off-grid potential, the new frontier for business. I'm Adam Kendall, a partner with McKinsey, based in Nigeria, and very excited to have the panel today. That was a very interesting introductory video there for us. I think we would all agree that when we think about power provision, it's not just about power provision when we can get it, but we do need it available all the time. So I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea that the people need power all the time, not just when the sun shines or when the utilities are able to operate. I've got an exciting panel today, so let me just go around and introduce everyone. Let me start with Bruce Anderson, who is the CEO of 24/7 Solar. Bruce is the co-inventor of the 24/7 Solar plant, a modular, coal-competitive concentrated solar power system, which according to their website can operate at generation levels as small as 400 kilowatts, which is great from an off-grid electricity provision point of view.
Thank you, Adam. It's good to be here.
We have Joan Shahenza, director with the Energy Access Financial Advisory, leading the African Mini-Grid Developers Association financial advisory work or financial advocacy work on tariffs, subsidies, and guaranteed products. We then have Greg Nicholas, the manager of project development with Lesedi Nuclear Services, responsible for initiating and developing infrastructure projects through to financial close across all types of power generation. So not just nuclear from that perspective. Tumi Mphahlele, the director and co-founder of iGen, a lithium-ion battery assembly facility, which is making moves to significantly increase local content in their batteries. Tumi is also on the board of the South African National Energy Association. And we have Novani Ganes-Johnson, who's the Southern African sales lead for Eaton. Eaton is an intelligent power management company. Novani is responsible for managing all of their Southern African sales activities. So welcome to our panelists, and thank you very much for joining us for this discussion today. So as a starting point, I wanted to kind of frame what we're talking about from an off-grid perspective, just so we're all on the same page. Off-grid can cover anything from, frankly, solar lanterns all the way through to large-scale industrial-sized C&I facilities for mines and oil and gas facilities. What we wanted to focus on today is probably a little bit more in the middle. So from mini-grids, metro grids, like what you're seeing emerge in the DRC, and then C&I facilities. So that's kind of the frame of reference that we're going to be aiming for today. And looking forward to the conversation. Where I'd like to start is, we're talking about off-grid potential. We're talking about, is this the new frontier for business? I'd like to start with a question to all the panelists, which is, what are you most excited about in terms of the off-grid potential of the African energy sector? Why are we here today? What makes you excited? Bruce, let's start with you.
Well, I'm excited because there's such a strong parallel between bringing distributed power generation, I'll say 24/7, to the part of the world, Africa, the continent, that has not had it before, or hasn't had it sufficiently, or in economically available terms. It's so similar to what happened with our telephone and communication system, where Africa leapt over the rest of the world and bypassed all that expensive infrastructure that is no longer needed for communications, specifically phones. This is a huge opportunity for Africa, and particularly as it emerges and begins competing with the West, because as we know, clean energy solutions require capital investment today that covers fuel costs for a generation, and that's stable, and non-increasing cost of power is going to be an incredible competitive advantage in the future. So it positions Africa to be a real economic powerhouse in the future.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Bruce. Joan, what makes you excited about it?
Absolutely, Adam. So we are in the decade of action and for the achievement of SDGs. And obviously with 600 million households still lacking access to electricity, we see the great potential for mini grids to be able to provide least cost electrification solutions and really a pathway to electrifying rural households that are not served by the grid. Having said this, I'd like to point out that the World Bank $500 million report, for that really looked at, the fact that 490 million people would be served at least cost by around 210,000 mini grids, mostly solar hybrids, and that this would ideally require an investment of 220 billion. And we really see this space, very ripe for mini grid development. And as per the last AMDA benchmarking report that was released in 2019, we saw that the cost of connection is really falling, right? So it's almost a third of, the connection of grid-tied power. And we do believe that even as, of course, competitiveness of the mini grid space and mechanical equipment costs come down, we'll begin to see, mini grids really taking their place as a least cost method for electrifying rural households. So there is enormous potential there, but obviously, and I know we'll discuss this in subsequent conversations, there's need to really put the correct regulatory environment and really to ensure that there is flow of concessional financing that will unlock the space.
All right, let's not jump ahead too quickly here. Definitely, we'll talk about some of those elements. I'm going to jump around a little bit. Navani, what makes you excited about this space?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I think for me, what's exciting is that we're at a point where we can offer a standalone electrical power system that uses multiple generating resources and that can offer clean electric power to the grid. I think what's exciting also about that is that you're having a grid system that is resilient. You're not depending on large energy infrastructure. It's sustainable. It's low in greenhouse gases. In some cases, you have the flexibility to even sell back that clean electric power back into the grid. And it's efficient. You can also optimize how you consume it. To be at a point where we're able to offer that in decentralized locations is exciting.
Great, Navani, thank you. Greg, as someone who designs these sorts of systems that Navani talks about and gets them to financial close, what makes you excited?
500 million people who don't have electricity at the moment. There's such a demand and a market and an opportunity out there. In addition to that, we're not having to compete against existing systems that are already in place, that are competing with, that are currently using fossil fuels to generate electricity, that have costs, and hence, you've got that resilience to implement new systems. Also, with the advances in technology, I mean, if we just look back on what's happened with the energy sector over the last 10 years, we're going through a revolution at the moment, and that revolution is going to continue not only in the types of systems that are being implemented and how electricity is being generated and sold, but also in the technology that's actually being used to generate this technology. So I think we're really in exciting times. However, we just need to make sure that the regulatory systems in place are there to facilitate mini grids as opposed to hinder them.
So I've heard two people talk already about the regulatory systems required. So we'll have to dive down and touch that one. Tumi, last but certainly not least, what's your perspective on this? Not the regulatory systems yet. We'll get there.
What we are excited about is the fact that there's almost a huge focus on looking at components of grid systems to go cheaper in order to allow a lot more people to take them up. But what's more exciting for us is how do we then get the same communities that we are trying to get onto off-grid systems to also co-develop. So we're looking at solutions that are developed by communities, but that will also be maintained. So we are looking at development that is driven from the communities that actually develop these. So our focus is really on how do we make local content a lot more a reality. Because what has happened in the past is we import solutions, and the opportunity to grow jobs, the opportunities to grow skills are not really catching up fast enough. So yes, we would like to see that there is more adoption, but we would like to see that the skills development and the jobs go along with that. And so our focus, for example, in South Africa is to look at how we bring that in for the benefit of all of the African continent.
Right, and I'm really happy you mentioned the point on local content and job creation, because this is actually an opportunity for the continent as well. As we progress on this green transition, this green revolution, how does Africa actually create jobs in this space and position itself to be one of the leaders across many of these sectors? That's not this panel, but it's certainly something that I'm excited about. I'd like to sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Just to add on to that, I think the whole mini grid is a facilitator for economic growth in general. So
Absolutely.
It's not just what electrification, the business around electrification, but electrifying communities is just going to create massive amounts of general economic opportunity and economic upliftment in general for communities.
And not only that, but that economic upliftment actually also makes the mini grids more economically viable themselves. So it's a really nice virtuous relationship there as well. All right, so I've heard regulations. Sorry,
could I just add one thing?
Yeah.
In more industrialized countries, industrial heat. Most industries that make things require heat, and most of the time to get that heat requires the combustion of fossil fuels. And so, as we electrify communities in Africa, we also have to keep in mind that in order to really create those jobs, you have to create industry. If you create industry, you've also got to have heat, industrial grade heat.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bruce. And that brings a different sort of challenge in terms of the scale of energy provision required in order to provide that industrial scale heat, obviously, which I imagine is something that the 24/7 plants can potentially provide as well. So let's, we've been talking for 15 minutes, and we're all very excited about the opportunity, and clearly it's a significant opportunity with the 500 million people and the potential consumption of that group, even though it's a base of the pyramid group. But it's not happening. It's not happening. We've been talking about this for a number of years. So what are the challenges? Obviously, there's a significant financial challenge. So maybe Joan would love your perspective on what's needed financially to make this happen. We've got subsidies in Nigeria, and it's still a little bit slow to take off. What can the international community do? What can the developers do from a finance perspective or other perspective? What's required to really unlock this?
Absolutely, that's a really good question, Adam. And I'd like to say that obviously within the space, we've got the Mini Grid Funders Club, group, that is consisting, different funders and financiers who are putting in money within the space, and they have committed $2 billion US. However, the rate of deployment has been very slow, and there have been many reasons why the rate of deployment has been slow. The rate is currently at 13%. And some of these reasons are really, centered around the nascency of the mini-grid space. And obviously, within the mini-grid space, you find, the sector is not as well developed, and there's still, lack of scale for most of the mini-grid developers who are operating within sub-Saharan Africa. So having said that, obviously, you find the space really has got a lot of early stage venture capitalist equity and private equity funds that are supporting mini-grid development, and there's really a lack of scale and pathway to long-term infrastructure debt. So what needs to happen within that space is, number one, I would say a radical change of the mini-grid business model, a move from the unsolicited proposal basis where a mini-grid developer would go on the ground, sign on an agreement with the end consumers who are rural households, and get the license to operate, then go to the regulator and be able to get a tariff. So that needs to change to a point where it's actually there's actually a contractual based agreement that can be bankable, where you can ideally for guarantee issuers, they can actually use this document to then be able to develop de-risking tools, right? Yep. Because that document will then be able to have and allocate risks and obligations between parties. So I guess there's really a lot that needs to move, for that concessionary financing to move, and for us to move from where we are to a point where we have long-term infrastructure debt that is 10 to 15 years. Because what is happening within the space is really, we see a lot of short-term working capital debt, but really nothing, nothing long-term, and there's very little longevity in this, within the debt and the tenors that are, being given. I know last year there was one deal, that was done for long-term debt financing, a deal that was closed by FMO, which was really, one of the great successes we've seen within the space. And I know that IFC are also trying to, and they have developed the, the DRC market on the basis of the scaling mini-grid program. And the idea here is to have, that long-term infrastructure debt financing flowing into the space. And this is really a welcome move, even as we, really hope that the mini-grid space will attain the maturity that it deserves, and really also a recognition that, mini-grids are infrastructure assets, are not really social enterprises.
Yeah, and Navani, in the discussion that we were having before, you were saying that mini-grids aren't yet commercially viable, and obviously one of the challenges around that is what Joan was talking about. What should we be doing to make them more commercially viable? The de-risking of the debt is one thing, creating the long-term viability. What else can we be doing, and what could Eden be doing as well?
I think one of the things we can be doing is creating more demand for it. I mean, we need to actually start somewhere. It's still seen as just as a concept. And we need to start showcasing some of those practical applications that we had, that they are actually working. Eaton has some projects where we've partnered with larger industrials to have these kind of mini microgrid setups, and they're working. And I think the idea is we need to kind of do more of that in Africa, so that investors can see that they do work and they are a viable solution.
So showing that it's something that does actually deserve debt that's maybe longer than 2, 3, 4 years, and maybe you can access the 10, 15-year debt from that perspective as well. Yeah, absolutely. Bruce.
There's something that, unless you're really immersed in the space, isn't appreciated fully. Those of you who are in the space will understand what I'm talking about. First of all, the smaller scale systems on a per kilowatt installed basis are more expensive than the larger systems. That's number one. So you're already strike one. The other is that when you talk long-term financing for small applications, you're talking 10 or 15 years. But for utility scale, typically you're talking 20, 30, sometimes even longer numbers of years. And that combination of difference has a tremendous impact on the ability to finance these smaller scale systems. So somebody smarter than me, more creative, has got to figure out a way of getting around this problem, because that's a big challenge. It's hard enough getting larger scale projects financed for a longer period of time that are less expensive than smaller systems. So this is a huge problem that the financial community and those of you who are involved at that scale need to come to grips with.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. Greg, your profile talks about getting projects through to financial close and bankability, which is that holy grail for a project. How's that going in the off-grid community? How's that going in the small scale distributed energy space? Is that something you're focusing on?
It's fine if you're dealing with a large COI off-taker who's got the balance sheet to back up the off-take. And that's the problem, is we need something innovative, something different. We're already looking at opportunities where we're actually creating an energy exchange. So similar to your normal share exchange, where there's got willing buyers and willing sellers, which should definitely help the off-grid sector to expand to a much greater sector of off-takers. And then leveraging off what Bruce mentioned a lot earlier, I think the energy sector and some of the big utilities possibly need to look at how the cell phone sector operates in Africa, and the whole pay-as-you-go and using cell phones for everything. It wasn't as if they had to sign up a million users before they decided to invest in the infrastructure that allowed them to supply cellular communications to all of those people. I think the utilities have the opportunity now to see this as a new market, to take some capital, venture capital, and invest in providing electricity to smaller communities. It's a case of build it and they will come. As soon as you provide them with the opportunity to use electricity, we are certain that the people will grasp it. And once they have experienced the benefits of electricity, that they will keep on using it and be prepared to pay for using it. So I think it's a case, we are to a certain extent a little bit in a catch-22, who sort of goes first. But really we need the venture capital out there to step in and to start creating the mini grids. Just one other comment. I know some of us mentioned regulatory issues. What we also need is we need governments to put in place regulations to facilitate and to incentivize off-grid installations or mini grid installations, as opposed to hinder it. We're seeing in South Africa at the moment that there's a move now to change the tariff structure. So anybody who's got localized solar or other things are now going to pay huge accessibility charges just to access grid connection and grid power when they need it, because of the fact that the utilities are now selling less power. That is a hindrance to mini grids, and it's what we need to change that, and rather have incentives to ensure that people go to mini grids.
Yeah, and we'll touch on, if we've got time, we'll touch on those utilities a little bit later. I mean, so we've been talking a bit about the kind of the financial innovation side. You've got the venture capitals, you've got the IFC, you've got the new entity, the Foundation Philanthropic Capital through the Global Energy Alliance that was announced at COP26. We haven't talked about the technical innovation. And Tumi, maybe I'll come to you here as someone who's in the equipment business that's actually enabling these types of technologies. What's the type of technology innovation that we could expect to see that will help make these more effective, more commercially viable, more financially viable in the long run?
So in parallel to the technology that is under development, the huge focus on making these batteries smaller. For example, I know there are batteries all over the world that are looking at making batteries 2.5 times less than their size, and that plus 2.5 times more, etc. What we are looking at is having the ability to be able to make these systems talk to one another such that it becomes much more viable to actually buy even smaller systems. So if you think about community where we're saying the costs are too huge, and if you think about battery, an off-grid system, you always have to have battery backup in order for you to be able to use the energy, for example, at night or when there's no wind, etc. So the ability to be able to build information technology that makes these systems talk to one another to a point that you don't need as much. So, and they can even predict the usage and be able to make it much more efficient. For example, in South Africa, a few companies looking at building their own battery management system. This is a kind of system that actually manages battery, overcharge, undercharge, and overcurrent, and all of that stuff to make sure that it's efficient. Once you have that kind of technology as IP in your space, then you are able to then manipulate and see how you can make it work for local conditions. And that has been our major focus really in the last year or two.
Thanks, Tumi. Bruce, I mean, technology innovation is core to what you do as well. How's the technology innovation that you're doing able to help the off-grid rural communities?
Well, this is my mantra. People need power all the time, not just when the sun is shining or the wind's blowing. And countries, at least those inside the governments who are most concerned about economic development, really have to understand that we wake up every day and we have fuel for breakfast. To grow economies requires power, requires energy, and all the time. And that will produce economic growth, produces industry, it produces jobs, produces demand for appliances and so on once you have power all night. It's really critical to develop new technologies that operate 24/7, because as Tumi just said, you've got PV during the day, maybe you have some batteries, and then what? You're probably burning fuel, expensive fuel, burning it in a genset, and that doesn't create the base, the foundation for economic growth when you're burning fuels as gensets. There've got to be alternatives. We're fortunate that we have something. It's not, it's still only 400 kilowatts, so it's not like 5 kilowatts, but even 400 kilowatts. And one of the things that we're trying to incent in discussions are the creation of economic development zones where technology like ours provides highly reliable, clean, economical power, but also industrial grade heat to attract industry and create jobs. And it's that combination that really is going to grow African economies.
Great. Greg, you had a thought on this?
Yeah, Bruce raised the comment, and I think something we mustn't forget about is the disconnect between baseload electricity and currently the understanding of typical renewable energy in the form of solar, wind, and trying to couple that with batteries and what have you. Concentrated solar is definitely one of those technologies that can provide, more of a baseload type approach to electricity, and we can find sort of modular, smaller systems, and so much the better. The other area of power generation where there's a lot of focus at the moment, and even though my company is sort of involved in nuclear, but modular nuclear is also seen as one of the areas where, that's going to provide baseload electricity in much smaller type quantities, which can be implemented in areas where you can supply a town or a city only with a modular nuclear solution, which provides baseload electricity and potentially also the opportunity to provide waste heat, which will power industry. I think Bruce's message is 100% correct, though, is that you need reliable, sustainable, continuous power to make sure that you produce proper economic development.
Thanks, Greg. Navani, I want to come to you and come to this idea of technology innovation. What role can the OEMs play and the energy management systems play to help drive this and help bring some of that kind of C&I capability into the mini grid space as well?
So I think, firstly, I'm gonna apologize. It just literally just started storming. So if you hear any thunder, it's the weather like that. But yeah, so I think companies like Eaton, lots of experience in the technology space, providing efficient, sustainable, reliable use of power. It's a natural progression for them to now be for us to now be looking at the future, which is how do we integrate that technology into renewable resources, and converting that renewable resources into power that can be used and later stored, right, as with Tubi's company. But and there's a lot of R&D going into it. I think we're all on board right now. This is the way of the future. We have those kind of products that are being used. We've got systems in place where we are using it. It's going to be continuous R&D. You never have that perfect, fit, but it's where the technology is moving and where the investment is right now. So I think we're at a point where we can say, yes, we can do this. We're ready.
It sounds like you've got support from the heavens behind you there as well. Navani, is enough money being spent on R&D in this space? Is there enough innovation in this space?
Yes, Eaton has. So in fact, at our offices here in Johannesburg, we have a microgrid application where we've spent the resources. We've got multiple generating assets to ensure that we can practice what we preach, basically. And so, yes, from a global perspective, I think we are doing a lot of R&D around it. Obviously, for the different grid types, for us specifically, it's more about having that uninterrupted power during production, which I think for a lot of industries in Africa, that is critical. In off-grid application, you're looking at more having the sustainable power that Bruce was talking about. But yes, I believe that companies are getting on board to the fact that this is the way the future is. The regulatories will help because it doesn't make it easier if government is not supporting this kind of initiative. But from a company perspective, in terms of technology, I think we are moving in that direction. Okay,
I definitely agree with you in the C&I space. I think that there's some very interesting things happening there. I'm not always convinced there's enough R&D in the more classic rural mini grid space. Joan, love to get your thoughts as someone from AMDA.
Absolutely. So there are several innovations within the space. And what we see are really, improvements within different electromechanical equipment. So number one, the metering, we are seeing a lot of smart meters being deployed within the space. On the solar PV, there's been, in the past few years, there's been very little, innovations that have come to my attention. However, having said that, even as we look at the space, we have seen, of course, the costs of this equipment going down significantly. And I'd say, a recent innovation that I've seen within the battery storage is, using hydrogen, to be able to then take on the lithium-ion battery storage that is currently in place. And so we welcome all these innovations, and we're really excited to see, where the space could be. The beauty of the mini grid space and the nascency of the space is that obviously, there's a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room for, equipment manufacturers to actually be able to put in place, equipment that, is affordable and that can scale and that is innovative and can take care of the needs of rural households, and at the same time give the, developers the return that they are looking for.
Thanks, Joan. I mean, you tee up a very important conversation, the role of African businesses to be able to actually provide some of these things. Tumi, how big is the market for you guys? And as you think about this space, how do we get more African manufacturers to be operating in this space, manufacturing the components required to drive this this off-grid potential?
The market in South Africa and the market in the rest of the continent is really huge. Our experience now is a lot of the energy storage that we bring into the continent is actually fully manufactured elsewhere. And although it's very difficult to compete, for example, with these cells that are manufactured mostly in large mega factories in China, is a lot more that we can still manufacture in countries in Africa, so that the job creation happens. And our experience really is that it's very hard to compete. So because we locally assemble, we bring in some of the base cells. We put on high quality finishes, such as switches, etc. Locally. The challenges are that the local product, which is higher quality, seems to be more expensive than a product that you fully import. And so the education there is just to show everyone the cost of the direct cost of the skills you are developing, etc. In the long run, it really benefits the country, because what that means is you are creating more jobs. You end up with even more people employed, and the economy actually gets better. So the business case is very difficult to put in place at this point, and so the first question that's asked is, how are your prices comparing with units that are manufactured in China? That's not supposed to be the question. The question is, how much more benefit is it to the economy to actually assemble some of these products locally? And the good thing is we are looking at skills development, we are looking at jobs. So it is quite a bit of a challenge, even for large scale. For example, in South Africa, we have this large scale solar and etc. Utility scale. Even then, it's very difficult to convince these guys to work with us, because they always have to look at the cost and say, look, how much more is it going to cost us? And so these competitive bids make it even much more difficult. But yeah, in essence, you have to look at overall cost and not just the cost of the unit. That's how we sell this.
Yeah, there's huge benefit from being able to do it locally. And Bruce and Navani, you guys are both kind of in the equipment space. Bruce, you're building the plants, and Navani, you're doing a lot of the equipment as well. What will it take to get more of these things to be manufactured, not just assembled, but manufactured locally, whether it's South Africa or the rest of the continent?
I'll take a shot at that, because it starts with intention. When we first developed our system, our intention was to provide 24/7 solar power at a clean power and at an economically competitive cost. And so our mantra was mass production. But our other mantra was job creation. We didn't want to provide that kind of power just for the sake of doing it. It's about economic growth, people's lives, and that means jobs. So literally 80% of the cost of 24/7 solar plants and our long duration battery can be made in Africa. The only thing that can is competitively, because it is local. These are big systems, but compared with, let's say, a small battery, and the savings in transportation cost, offsets shipping from the other side of the world. So it starts with intention, and so companies, entrepreneurs who are developing new technology have to have the intention. Design this in an appropriate technology way so that it is applicable to the real world that your customers are living in.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Navani, you bring a lot of services into the space, so you already have some local capabilities from the service side. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we have both manufacturing and services local capabilities. And I think that's important to show the mindset of the company, and that, you know, we're invested in those in the country. And so, you know, by doing that, you're promoting the brand, but you're also showing that, you know, it's not just for the company itself. It's also, like Bruce said, it's that intention to improve the quality of life in that country. So that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg?
Just to follow on from what Tumi said earlier, Adam, is that competitive bidding is a sort of bit of a hindrance at the moment, because the mass production and the economies of scale are such that Africa will never be able to compete on a standalone basis with the large manufacturing sectors elsewhere. The other thing that Bruce mentioned earlier is you need power. So it's a bit of a catch-22. You want local industries to manufacture equipment for the power generation sector, but we're not producing enough power in order for that to happen. But that aside, I think, you know, with the RMI, the REI PPP programs that were initiated here in South Africa, the intent was to try and promote local content. Yeah. But in many instances, the large IPPs and the large EPCs that are executing these projects have found a way around it. And if you think about the amount of solar plants and wind turbine plants that have been executed in South Africa, and yet today we don't have a solar PV panel manufacturing plant in South Africa or a wind turbine manufacturing plant in South Africa. Why is that? Because they found a way to negotiate their ways out of the localization requirement. And without government really sticking to their commitments, it's going to be very difficult to compete against the mega cheap production from the East.
Yeah, and there's actually lessons we can learn from other African countries on this. You're seeing Morocco has wind OEM being manufactured, not just assembled, but being manufactured in Morocco. And obviously you've got a range of different small scale things happening in East and West Africa as well. So this manufacturing opportunity and the potential jobs that could be created from it is something that we need to figure out how to avoid losing those. We've been talking about innovation. So let's talk about utilities from an innovation perspective. You know, ultimately the utilities can embrace what's happening and accept it and say, how do we be a part of it? Or they can be protective. And they can put regulations in place or work with governments to in some cases put regulations in place to prevent it from happening. So how will utilities survive and evolve if industries and commercial institutions and ultimately residences go off grid? Or how should we be thinking about utilities when there's the 500 million people who don't have access to power and the utilities haven't provided that access? What's the role of utilities in all of this, and what should it be? Joan, as a mini grid developer person, what's your thoughts on the utilities?
Yes, Andrew. So I'll unpack the question and tackle it in different perspectives. So from an innovation perspective, you know, just off of the conversation that we've had, you know, on technological improvements, I'd say that there's really a place where utilities need to be at in terms of driving innovation. And we see different utilities within the African market trying to embrace the ESCO model, where, you know, they're actually acting as energy service companies who are developing, designing, and building and arranging financing for projects, mostly within the energy efficiency space. And I would say this is really critical in terms of capturing back the C&I category, market category, that is slowly, you know, being ebbed away from, you know, utilities portfolio. And having said that, you know, utilities, and especially within sub-Saharan Africa, we do know that, you know, from the recent statistics that we know, only 2 utilities could sort of cover their, cost of operation. And that was in Uganda and Seychelles. And, on the basis of that, so you find that most utilities, are not investment grade and most are cash strapped. So there's really an opportunity for private sector to come on board and number one, be able to, feed into the different, into the integrated planning of these utilities. So be it within the grid tied space, there's still, a place for private sector participation there. Within the C&I space, obviously a huge market. And, so there's a great potential for, solar, C&I, and embedded generation, and especially from the private sector perspective. But having said that, I think what is really important is the complementarity, because we can't really say that, we are, as mini grid developers sort of working on our own. So there's need for, the utility and the mini grid space to then be able to complement one another, because mini grids are really there to drive, rural households demand growth, right? And so that even when these utilities are arriving and when the grid arrives to these communities already have got some demand profile, which can then drive, the demand side management of utilities. So I guess it's really a lot of complementarity there. However, given, the space where utilities operate, I would say, it's really a wake-up call for utilities to ideally wake up and innovate. And so we are seeing, utilities like ESCOM, we're seeing, Kenya Power in Kenya, really trying to put in place reforms. And I guess those reforms are really welcome so that then, there's really a change in the market dynamics and a true growth in private sector investments and cooperation within the utilities and developers.
But I mean, many of these reforms that they're trying to put in place are defensive in nature. They see that their industrial and commercial customers are moving to C&I installation and C&I solutions, and they're saying we can provide that as well, as opposed to being progressive in nature, where they say there's these areas which aren't connected. Let's go and connect them. And I mean, you even frame the mini grids doing the hard work of actually building the energy demand in the communities, and then the utilities coming in later and just benefiting from that hard work. That doesn't seem like a stable business model for the mini grids in those cases. Bruce, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, there's a whole body of thought and knowledge around how companies change, because these are big companies, generally speaking, and they're very traditional, and they've done the same thing the same way for decades. And for ESCOM, it's a near death experience that changes you. In Kenya, perhaps it was enlightened leadership, but you can't count on either one to change. The companies that do want to change, though, and see this as an opportunity, need to learn from this body of knowledge about how change occurs from the inside. And there are several ways of doing it, but if you are a utility company that sees the writing on the wall, and I'm trying to think of something that's much louder than just writing on the wall, because that's, it doesn't get the message out that we're all feeling. But if you're a utility that sees that, then I think, to me, the first step is, okay, how do we change? That's got to be your question. How do we change internally? We've got to do something differently. How do we change as a company?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're running out of time. There's all sorts of other topics that I want to touch on, but I'm gonna pick two. The first is linking this to the overall theme of the African Energy Indaba around energy transition and ensuring that we're bringing access to the people who don't have it, which is obviously very linked to our panel. COP27 is going to be in Egypt, Africa's COP. It's an opportunity for us as the leaders in the energy space to really, and Bruce, you used this term before, use a bullhorn to bring attention to the opportunities, but also the imperative of actually doing something in this space, both from an energy transition point of view, but also from an energy access point of view. How can we take advantage of this opportunity? How can we take advantage of this COP27 coming up, where more than any time before, we will have the world's attention looking at the African energy challenges, again, whether it's energy transition or provision of energy access. Greg, let's start with you.
First and foremost, Adam, I think we need to stop preaching and blaming the first world for the situation that we're in, and saying that they generated the economies of fossil fuels, so we're going to do the same. We're all in the same sinking boat. So if we don't all start plugging the hole or shoveling water out the boat, we're all going to sink with it. And I think we have an enormous opportunity because of the fact that there is such a power demand, that we have the opportunity to implement systems right from the grassroots up and show how we can implement those systems straight away. But we need the assistance of all sectors, but most importantly, we need funding. And if we're going to rely on private funding to get this off the ground, I don't think that's going to be the way going forward, because private funding is there to get a return on shareholder investment. That's all that they're looking for. They're not looking for providing any brownie points or anything like that. But I think there's a huge market out here, and we have the opportunity to be innovators in this sector and illustrate how we, unlike the rest of the world, have the ability to drive a new sector and provide new markets for whether it's private investment, utilities. That's the message we need to send out. But I think there also needs to be a plea to all those that have the power to either facilitate or to hinder the development of power generation in Africa, especially mini grids, to rather come to the party and be a facilitator and not a hinderer.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Greg. We need funding is coming across loud and clear here, and the role of facilitating rather than hindering. Couldn't agree more there. Novani, what are your thoughts?
I echo what Greg's saying, right? It's the funding. Hear it, how that bullhorn needs to scream. It's not about that private equity. It's about how do we to fund those without saying, okay, what is the return on investment? Off-grid in rural and in rural areas and distributed energy is not about your return on investment. It's about seeing the economic development in those areas, and that is what government needs to try and put forward into COP27. It's a cry for help. That's what it is.
I hear that it's not about the return for investment, and I hear the argument of, when the US power systems developed, it was done on a community by community level. But ultimately, the money needs to come from somewhere. And in the US and in Europe, yes, it was developed by the governments, but it was the local governments. It wasn't foreign governments coming in and investing. So how do we get this funding? How do we enable it? How do we drive it? You don't need to necessarily answer this to me, but that's the question that I ask when I hear this point around the fact that it shouldn't always be about a return on investment. But at the same time, there's limited money out there from that perspective. To me,
for me, it's also about the high-level view and looking at these problems holistically, so that even the supply chain are actually looked at. For example, a lot of the minerals that go into these products that we put on our microgrids, they're actually mined on the continent. For example, lithium is actually mined here in Southern Africa. It leaves the shores and it comes back as a base cell. But the massive loss that we're looking at there is that the opportunity lost in beneficiating that. So when we move forward to see what the energy opportunities are like, we almost have to step 3 or 4 times backwards in order for us to see where are other opportunities lost. because the minerals are actually on this continent. We have people coming, taking our minerals away and bringing them back in a different format. And when we have an opportunity to go speak to COP, and these are the kind of issues that I think we could be raising as well.
Great. Bruce, over to you, and then we'll come back to Joan. Bruce?
Yeah, almost everything that's being discussed in this entire panel would be new to most other parts of the world. The issues, the challenges, the different kinds of solutions that are required. And so COP27 really is an opportunity to educate the world on the challenges here and how they're different and what needs to be done in order to address them.
Thank you, Bruce. Joan?
So I'd like to just say that obviously, and you'd said something about this, Adam, that rural electrification across the globe obviously required some form of subsidies to enhance the viability gap. Because there's really a difference between, the high cost of infrastructure and the low level of incomes for rural households. So it's no longer, for private sector to ideally ask for subsidies is no longer, I would say, a bad way of ideally progressing the conversation. So I do believe that even as we, develop agendas for this coming COP, that we really need to redefine what a climate resilient pathway to industrialization looks like. And especially for the African continent, because we have an opportunity to industrialize using cleaner, technologically, advanced parts, right? And Africa should embrace a decentralized pathway. And for us to ideally get there, we need to have, sort of the scalable, scalable funding in terms of concessionary and grant funding that are critical in developing, and expanding the mini-grid market. And also governments that are supporting mini-grid development should ideally, be able to also give fiscal measures and fiscal, incentives to the private sector to be able to get to that place.
We've gone 55 minutes, and we spoke about subsidies, and we spoke about financial incentives and things like that. And no one, I'm surprised, has mentioned the fossil fuel subsidies. So, Joan, you mentioned that the World Bank report where only two countries were covering their costs. That was including the fact that many of these countries have fossil fuel subsidies embedded in their cost. So it's actually even worse. And so it's terrible that we're talking about can we subsidize what needs to be done on the off-grid space when there's these massive subsidies on the fossil fuel side, and we have to recognize that, and we have to recognize the negative role that those fossil fuel subsidies are playing in this conversation as well. All right, so we've just got a couple minutes. Last question for everyone, and it's clear what some of the themes are. But we've got a great audience. We've got private sector, DFIs, utilities, governments, regulators, foundations, industry. Everyone is listening to this. What can the audience do? What's your request in 30 seconds or less to speed up the realization of this off-grid potential? Novani, let me start with you. Sorry, you put on stage for the first time.
What can the audience do? I think, wow, I really am put on the spot right now.
We can come back to you if you want.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, who's ready? Let me not just call on people. Bruce, please go ahead.
Work smarter, not harder.
Great, I like that. Joan.
Very quickly, we need regulations for scale within the mini-grid space. We need clarity on tariffs and long-term sustainability of those tariffs. We need contractual-based frameworks that allow for allocation of risks between parties. We do need smart subsidies that are not disruptive to the market and those that have got clear sunset clauses. We do need integrated renewable energy plans that then embrace decentralized renewable energy sources.
Is that all? Okay, good.
Yeah, there's more, but let me stop there.
Greg, over to you.
Let's implement something. Let's stop talking about it. Let's stop doing feasibility studies. Let's put some money together and actually start building some mini grid systems to prove the concept, learn some lessons, but that will allow us to actually implement more and more. Stop talking about it, let's start building it.
Tumi?
Let's make it holistic. Let's look at how we get communities involved so that they own and so that they can guide this kind of transition.
Great, thank you. Novani, you get the last word now.
I do get the last word. I think it's about let's making it sustainable and flexible. The future is flexible energy production, and that's what we need to ask for.
And for me, you know, there's a lot of different things that you guys have said, but real similarities in terms of let's go out there and start doing it. To Greg's point, you know, we keep talking about risk mitigation and all these things. Let's go out there and show where the real risks are by figuring them out, building it, figuring it out, and then coming up with the right technical products, financial products, and where necessary, regulatory instruments to make sure that we're addressing those. Bruce, Greg, Novani, Joan, and Tumi, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for the discussion today. And hopefully this is food for thought for the audience, and we can potentially take some of these thoughts and ideas and make sure that we have the right bullhorn leading up to COP27 later this year. Thanks very much, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Adam. Great job.